Andrew Natsios, the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs here at the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M. And I'd like to introduce our distinguished speaker this afternoon, who is a senior advisor to the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies. And she was a professor at Georgetown University. In fact, while I was there teaching for 6 years, but she was there for I think 30 years. Is that right, Dr. Stent?
42.
42. Her primary research focus is on Russian foreign policy, with special emphasis on the triangular U.S., Europe, Russia relationship. She is a senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution and co-chairs its Hewitt Forum on Post-Soviet Affairs. I could go through all of the things that she's done, but she is one of the most distinguished scholars on Russia, one of the experts, not just at Georgetown, but in the world. And so it is an honor for me to introduce her today and for her to be with us. Thank you, Dr. Stent. And I'll turn this over to you. We have a very good response rate for your talk. It's one of the best we've had this semester. So you've attracted a lot of attention.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you for inviting me to do this. And I think probably the fact that so many people are tuning in has to do with this situation that the world finds itself in today. So I'm going to do two things today. I'm going to talk about my book, Putins World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest, which has just come out in an updated paperback version 3 weeks ago. And then I'm going to focus on the Russia-Ukraine war. I welcome your questions, your comments. So first of all, let me just tell you why I wrote this book, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. I was really asking myself two questions when I wrote it. And the first one was, why were we in the West so wrong after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991? We believed that Russia would want to become more integrated with global society, that it would want to move further towards the West. We believed that it really had jettisoned the system that had existed during the Soviet times. And we were also wrong because we believed that closer economic ties with Russia would somehow spill over into closer political relations with Russia. So why were we wrong on these counts? Why do we now find ourselves in a situation where Putin's Russia today, this very highly personalistic system, really resembles very much the Soviet, the Tsarist system, albeit with a somewhat different ideology, but the persistence of all of these factors that have shaped Russian society and its view of the world for centuries. And then my second question in this book was, how was Putin's Russia, with a per capita GDP the size of that of Italy, with a sharply declining population, with crumbling infrastructure, how was it able to reassert itself so effectively on the world stage under Vladimir Putin, who's now been in power for 23 years, returning to parts of the world from which the Soviet Union had, of course, withdrawn after the Soviet collapse? And then the subsequent question, and that's really been borne out by the reactions to the Ukraine war, how is it that much of the rest of the world, if you put aside the West, sees Russia as a large authoritarian country with whom they can do business? They haven't sanctioned Russia, as we know, in the war. They haven't condemned it. And I will come back to that in my remarks. And then the third question, and the most difficult one that I was trying to answer, was how going forward could we maybe fashion a more productive relationship with Russia, although that question seems extremely difficult to answer at the moment. So let me look at the first question now, which was, why were we so wrong when the Soviet Union collapsed about what we thought might happen in Russia? And a simple answer to that is, we thought that during the Cold War, the problem of dealing with Russia, the Soviet Union, was because they were communists. But it turns out that really the problem with dealing with them is because they're Russians. And by that, I mean, Russians have a very distinct view of the world, of their place in it, and of what drives international relations. And that doesn't matter whether they're governed by czars, by communists, by post-communists. That view of the world is, as I said, quite persistent and enduring. If you go back into Russian history, and you look at the ideas that inform Russia's place, a sense of its place in the world, and Putin is very much a history man. When he's not fighting wars, he's opining and writing about history. This concept of the Russian idea, that Russia is this distinct superior civilization, it can never be really married with the West, and the West can never really understand it. And I'll just quote a 19th century Slavophile poet, Fyodor Turchev, and he wrote that there can be no alliance between Russia and the West, either for the sake of interests or for the sake of principles. And what he recommended was that Russia do its best to sow disunion and division in the West between the different countries in Europe. And Putin has on numerous occasions accused the West, specifically of the United States, of seeking to break up Russia. And he's doing that now. You know, somehow the US, we just can't wait.
Retest of the code maroon system. No action required.
He has said that the US wants to bite a juicy piece out of Russia, whatever that means. And what Putin does with this Russian idea now, and it's been very explicit, Russia is a communal civilization. It's superior to that of the West. It is unique. There's nothing like it. And he has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And he has said right from the beginning, 23 years ago, that he was determined to restore Russia as a great power. He said that its rightful role in the world. And for him, what is anathema is the kind of system advocated by the United States and its allies around the world, and of course the European Union, and one based what we would call the liberal international order. And then the other important influence, I think, on Putin's thinking and those people around him, and again, I come back to Russia's sense of its place in on the Eurasian land mass. So it has no natural borders except in the north. And therefore, throughout its history, it has expanded, trying to gobble up, if you like, influence, take under its wing its neighboring territories. And we can go back to the 18th century Empress Catherine the Great, who was, of course, the one who first annexed Crimea after wars with the Persian Empire. And Catherine the Great said, "That which stops growing begins to rot. I have to expand my borders in order to keep my people safe." So this idea of defensive expansionism is very, very deeply ingrained in, Russian history and in contemporary Russian thought about Russia's relationship with its neighbors. And you see that now, of course, playing out with horrific consequences in the war in Ukraine. This idea that Russia has to control its neighboring territories and that it is destined to do it, otherwise it cannot be safe. And so Russia today defines its security perimeter not as the borders of the Russian Federation, which is, after all, still the largest country in the world, but as the borders of the post-Soviet space. And that's certainly very much in the Russian mentality. And then briefly on the second question, why was Russia able to play a weak hand so well under Putin? And I think there are two reasons for it. And the first one is Putin had a plan when he entered the Kremlin in 2020. As I've said, he wanted to restore Russia as a great power. He was determined to overcome what he saw as the humiliation of the 1990s and become a great power again. And the West really had no similar plan. We were preoccupied with other issues, but Putin has single-handedly and single-mindedly focused on this since he came to power. And the second reason is that Putin has, at least until the outbreak of the Ukraine war, and therefore I would moderate my views on this now, that he was able until then to take advantage of opportunities presented to him by a distracted and divided West. So Putin was not only a former KGB agent, case officer, which taught him a little bit about how to manipulate people, but also he's a former judo champion. And in my book, I have a picture of him in 1976 in the Leningrad Evening News, hailing the 24-year-old judo champion of Leningrad, one Vladimir Putin, and saying that he would go far. I don't think they realized then exactly how far he would go, but because he's a skilled judo player and he's even co-authored books on judo, he understands how, even if Russia is the weaker party in a contest, to take advantage of his opponent's distraction and to prevail. And so until recently, at least, let's say until COVID hit, he used those skills very well. Now, before I turn to the Russia-Ukraine war, I just want to say something about the things that drive Putin's worldview and really are the basis of what we have seen now playing out in Ukraine, and really what we've seen happening since he came to power, and particularly since the annexation of Crimea and the launch of the first Ukrainian war in the Donbass in 2014. So Putin has believed right from the beginning that Russia has a right to a seat at the table on all important international decisions. So his aim throughout this has been to restore Russia to what he sees as the global board of directors. Secondly, he believes profoundly that Russia's interests are as legitimate as those of the West, and even if the West sees things differently, it should accept these legitimate Russian interests. And you hear him talking about that a lot. Thirdly, Russia has a right to a sphere of privileged interests in the post-Soviet space. So until the Ukraine war broke out, we would say that he wanted all of the countries in the post-Soviet space to recognize that they had to listen to what Moscow said, that the traditional ties should still bind them, even if they were independent states. And as part of that, obviously, if Russia is to have this sphere of influence, no Euro-Atlantic structures, i.e. NATO or the European Union, should move any closer to Russia's borders. Fourthly, and we really see this playing out now, some states are more equal than others, to quote George Orwell. Putin has said on many occasions there are only 4 truly sovereign countries in the world: Russia, China, the United States, and India. And by the way, I note those are 4 countries that have not signed on to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. We'll come back to that. But all other countries, from Putin's point of view, have limited sovereignty, and they shouldn't expect to be able to make decisions by themselves, particularly on important foreign policy issues. Fifthly, Russia has always presented itself under Putin as a leader of status quo powers. Now, we might quibble with this, but recognizing all existing governments, irrespective of how they came to power, and painting the United States particularly, but the West in general, as revisionist powers. And blaming the United States for regime change in Iraq, in other countries. Sixthly, Putin, like his predecessors, has always believed that Russia's interests are best served by a fractured transatlantic alliance. And so we have seen Russia consistently trying to amplify divisions within the Western alliance. And of course, with all the Russian disinformation and the use of social media, this has become, they've ramped this up at least in the past decade. And then finally, Putin and Xi Jinping, but Putin has always said that he believes that in the need for a post-West order. In other words, a global order where the United States and its allies' Western values do not dominate. And I would have said until the outbreak of the war, his idea of a post-West order was very old-fashioned. It was the 19th century concert of Europe, where you have a number of great European powers sort of dictating how the world was governed. He's also praised the Yalta system very much. So in the Cold War era, the bipolar Soviet and US division of the world, if you like, again, into spheres of influence. But by now, I don't think that that's his view of world order anymore. I see what Russia is doing is trying to create a Hobbesian, a disruptive global order where there are no rules of the game. And by the way, I think that is in contrast to China, which still believes in a post-West order, but one where there are still some rules of the game. So let me turn now to the Russia-Ukraine war. And briefly cover a few points. First of all, why did Putin launch the war when he launched it, i.e. on February 24th, 2022. So Putin has definitely been trying since 2014 to relitigate the end of the Cold War. By now, he does not believe that the Soviet collapse was legitimate, and nor does he believe that it was over. And so this is a process that has been going on now for 3 decades, and he's really trying to reverse that. I do not believe that it was that he felt threatened by NATO expansion or what he calls Western provocations. We can certainly discuss that in the Q&A, but this was really an unprovoked invasion. No one was threatening Russia. Ukraine much weaker than Russia, and the United States and its NATO allies were really not interested in invading Russia, as Putin now claims that they were. But I think it's important to understand this belief that he can undo what happened in 1991. He can undo the Soviet collapse. So Putin has likened himself to Peter the Great, who after his wars with Sweden in the early 18th century took over the Baltic states. Putin has been talking about Russia having a right to return historical lands to it. And so we really do have this imperial mindset that we know informs him and the people around him. And the idea that other European empires over the centuries have collapsed. If you could just go in the 20th century, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Britain, the British, the French empires, you can go back in history. Russia appears to be, from his point of view, the one empire that will never collapse and has a right in perpetuity to dominate its neighboring lands. Now, the timing of the invasion last year was determined by several factors. We know that Putin waited until the end of the Beijing Olympic Games to do it because, having met with Xi Jinping just before they began in Beijing, he understood that he shouldn't launch anything before then. And by the way, as far as we know, he did not inform Xi Jinping then of the extent of what he was going to do in Ukraine, and may have left him with the impression that it was going to be, quote unquote, a limited operation to consolidate control in the Donbas region, which of course had been at war since 2014 when Russia started that war. Putin looked around, and what did he see? He saw Volodymyr Zelensky with a 25% popularity rate, which we tend to forget now. Prior to the war, his government was sort of in disarray. He wasn't doing very well. And of course, as we know, Putin anyway doesn't believe that Ukraine is a separate nation and it doesn't have a right to have its own separate state, but he saw a weak government there. Then he looked at the United States. He looked at the withdrawal from Afghanistan. He thought the Biden administration was weak, that it wouldn't respond. He looked at Europe. The French, the British, the Germans were all distracted by various important domestic issues, and he thought that Europe wouldn't really be push back on anything like that. And he mistakenly believed that Europeans were so addicted to Russian gas and to their economic relationship with Russia that they would not want to jeopardize this by reacting very strongly to a Russian invasion. And Putin did look back in 2014, and he saw that when Russia had annexed Crimea and begun this war in the Donbas, the Western reaction was tepid. The Obama administration, yes, it imposed some sanctions, but it essentially accepted that this was an existential issue for Russia, Ukraine, and it wasn't for the United States. The Europeans went along with the sanctions too, but they were fairly mild. So there was no reason from Putin's point of view to anticipate the kind of very robust sanctions that were imposed on them. And then, of course, Putin at this point underestimated the Ukrainians' military capabilities, and by the way, so did the United States, and he vastly overestimated his own army's military capabilities, and I would say the US and its allies also overestimated them. So as we know, the goal in February 2022 was to march onto Kiev, to take it in 3 or 4 days, and we know that the Russian officers and soldiers carried with them ceremonial uniforms that they were going to wear the following week as they had a victory parade on the streets of Kiev. Where are we now in the war? And of course, what we've seen now is we are in, after the initial failure of the Russians to take Kiev and then regrouping and then fighting mainly in the east and in the south, where we are now is we are in this grinding war of attrition. Really nothing much has changed in the last 4 months, the Russians have taken a tiny bit more territory, but not very much. There is this intense fighting still going on in the city of Bakhmut, which is largely destroyed. It's been going on since August. But the Ukrainians are holding out, and they're mainly fighting the mercenary forces of the Wagner group, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin. And remember, he is now at war, well, not literally, but at least verbally, with the Russian Defense Ministry, and whom he accuses of being incompetent. So this is a grinding war, and there's still many casualties. We believe that over 200,000 Russians have either been killed or wounded in action, or severely wounded. And the numbers for Ukraine are probably not much less than that, somewhat less than that. We have, I think, less of an idea of exactly what they are. But obviously, the toll has been tremendously high. We know about the atrocities that have been committed in different cities in Ukraine by Russian soldiers and mercenaries. We know that Russia has been attacking the infrastructure of Ukraine for months now, depriving millions of Ukrainians of electricity, hot water, of heat during the winter. Now they've come out of the winter. We know that they've attacked indiscriminately civilian targets, and that they occupy the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, one of the largest in Europe, that they've used this now as a military base. I was listening the other day to a talk by Rafael Grossi, who's the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the situation is quite dire there in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and obviously they're trying to get the situation under control. So many danger points there. And then, of course, we have millions of Ukrainian refugees who have taken refuge either in the Baltic states, Poland particularly, and some of them have gone to Russia. And then we have about 1 million Russians who've left Russia since the war began, either because they opposed it from the beginning or because they wanted to avoid the draft. And a lot of those people are in post-Soviet states like Kazakhstan, Armenia, Georgia. Their welcome is now less fulsome in certain European countries because there are questions about exactly what their views are. But anyway, many of them, and many of the Russians who fled at the beginning are some of the best and brightest. They're young, they're tech savvy. So this amounts to a brain drain from Russia too. Now, despite all the horrors of this war, the majority of Ukrainians want to continue fighting. The vast majority of them say that they will continue fighting till they win, because for them, this is really a war of independence. This is a war for their existence. Russia, because the army was doing so badly, Putin announced in September that he had annexed 2 more territories in Ukraine. So there are 4 total territories Russia claims to have annexed, but it doesn't control all of them. But Russia has now put this forward as a condition for any kind of negotiations, that the Ukrainians would now have to accept the loss of a wide swathe of territory in their country. I would just say, and we can come back to this, that so far the prospects for negotiation are very dim. There were negotiations last March and April, conducted in Turkey under the auspices of President Erdogan. And there was some agreement that the Russians would withdraw to where they were on February 23rd, i.e. before the invasion began, so not with the extra territory they've taken. And in return for doing that, the Ukrainians would agree that they wouldn't seek NATO membership, but they would seek security guarantees from major countries. It was unclear how many. That all fell apart in April with the discovery of the atrocities at Bucha, and then the Russians really weren't very interested in it. And so at the moment, as I said, I think the prospects for negotiations are dim, and this is a war that could go on for a very long time. Now, we know that the majority of the collective West, that's the United States, Europe, and Asian allies, have condemned and sanctioned Russia. But we also know that the rest of the world, including what we call the global South, and of course China, have not done that. And the question is, why haven't they done that? And there really is a very large gap between the way people in the West view this war and people in the rest of the world. Now, China is a special case. We can talk more about that. China really came to Russia's rescue in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea and the imposition of sanctions. And China sort of bailed Russia out. It got a very good deal on a natural gas pipeline from Russia to China. And China in this war has remained technically neutral. But I think if anyone who paid attention to Xi Jinping's visit to Russia last week will see that it's not really neutral, or it's a pro-Russian neutrality. It hasn't sanctioned Russia. It has parroted everything that the Russians have said. It repeats all the Russian propaganda about why the war broke out, blaming NATO and the West for this, and of course condemning sanctions. But until now, China has in fact not supplied Russia with lethal weaponry. We don't know what Putin and Xi talked about in their private meeting. They had a 4-hour meeting last Monday, and we don't know what was promised, but at least publicly, the Chinese haven't said they will do that. And so far, the Chinese have avoided, getting against the West in terms of the sanctions. They've avoided doing anything that would have them sanctioned, but we again don't know whether they may change that. There are some rumors that the Chinese or some Chinese firms have managed to evade some of the sanctions and have been supplying with Russia with some components that could go into weapons. But China certainly sees itself as the leader now with Russia of an anti-Western alliance, if you like, not an alliance, a partnership, and China definitely does not want Russia to lose this war, because for the Chinese, the nightmare would be Russia loses the war and someone comes to power in Moscow, hard as it is for us to imagine that rethinks Russia's foreign policy and the decisions it's made and is willing to mend fences with the West. And that for China would be a very negative outcome. But what about the rest of the global South? What about India, for instance, which is a partner of the United States in the Quad? It has not condemned Russia. It hasn't sanctioned Russia. It's now Russia's largest consumer of oil, and it still, of course, buys lots of weapons from Russia, and has said that, Russia, of course, is historically an important partner for India. And then we can look at the other BRICS countries, South Africa, which not only has not condemned Russia, but recently conducted naval exercises with China and Russia. And interestingly, and again, maybe we can come back to this, South Africa has signed on to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. There is going to be a BRICS summit in South Africa later on in the year. The question is, will Vladimir Putin go to South Africa for this summit? Because legally, South Africa, I believe, is committed or is supposed to follow the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant and in fact arrest Putin. So this will be an interesting space to watch. But Brazil is another country, another major BRICS countries that hasn't condemned Russia, and really all of the Middle East, Africa, and much of Latin America, including Mexico, have not condemned or sanctioned Russia. And I think the answer to that is many of these countries view what's happening between Russia and Ukraine as a local European conflict. And they also look at the United States and they accuse the United States of hypocrisy. And they talk about Iraq, they talk about Vietnam, they talk about the US involvement in Afghanistan. And so they say what Russia is doing in Ukraine is no different from what the United States has done. So a lot of this is also determined by, not so much by their perception of Russia, but by their perception of the United States. And hence they're not willing to join in the condemnation or the sanctions. Although if you look at the UN votes, obviously some countries in the global South have voted in the General Assembly to condemn Russia for the invasion. So there is a huge gap there, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. And I think that's something which, therefore, the US and its allies in Europe and Asia will have to deal with. All right, let me just say a couple of words now about about Putin's game plan going forward and how long Western unity will last. So Putin, I think, definitely believes that Western unity will crack. He does not believe that this transatlantic and trans-Pacific coalition is going to remain intact, and therefore he can wait them out, and then Russia can defeat Ukraine, because Ukraine won't be getting the support, the weapons, and the financial support that it's getting now. That's his game plan. So what's the future for this? What's the evidence for this? So if you look at the United States, you can see in public opinion polls that support for the US support to Ukraine is softening, and it's particularly softening among Republicans. Democrats, by and large, remain committed to supporting Ukraine against Russia. The Trump wing of the Republican Party, of course, favors Russia in this conflict, and you do have Kevin McCarthy and the leadership now in the House of Representatives questioning, quote unquote, a blank check for Ukraine. And of course, we have elections coming up next year, and this will be a subject. It already is. And so I think probably 2023, the year that we're in now, will be the peak year for support of Ukraine. The discussions about next year's congressional allocations for Ukraine will start in the fall, and we'll see where it takes us. But I think that clearly there's more of a debate in the US, and the need, I think, for the Biden administration to explain to the American public why it is in our interest to support this war in Ukraine. And in Europe, too, you've had demonstrations in certain countries against support for Ukraine. They're suffering much more than we are of the after effects of the sanctions, inflation, high energy prices. They managed to get through this winter without Russian gas, or without most of Russian gas. It may not be so easy next year. So, depending on what happens in different European elections next year, the support may soften as well. And yet, I think it's remarkable that it's been as strong as it has until now, given the variety of interests in these countries. And I think Italy is a very interesting case. You have a far-right government that came into power where everyone thought, they're basically going to support Russia and not support Ukraine. But the Prime Minister, Meloni, she has been adamant that it's in Italy's and in the world's interest to support Ukraine against Russian aggression. So we'll see how long that lasts. One thing I think that's notable that we shouldn't dismiss is that Putin has managed to consolidate his power during this year of the war. As I've said before, people who oppose the war, many of them have left, and those who remain in Russia have to remain quiet, because if you criticize the war, you can be jailed. And the repression has gotten much worse over this year of the war. And basically the elites, the people who many of us knew as kind of outward-looking, pragmatic technocrats who interacted a lot with the West, with the US, with Europe, with the Asian allies, all of those people who one assumes must have looked very askance at this war and what it's done. They've also accepted, I think by now, that they have no choice but to remain quiet and to do what Putin tells them to do. They made a bargain with Putin, early on in his reign, if you like, and they didn't expect that the bargain would turn out like this, that they'd be dealing with a large-scale war. But still, they have accepted that they don't have any choice, and that goes for the head of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, and many of the key, if you like, economic figures in Russia. And so Putin looks stronger now today domestically than he did when the war began. So I think that I am running out of time there, and I do want to give people a chance to questions and comments. This is not a very optimistic outlook. It's very hard to see how this war ends, when it ends, and how we then deal with Russia going forward, because we have very little insight into that at the moment. People are beginning to think about this, the reconstruction of Ukraine, but it's all a little bit premature. So let me stop there, and I will look forward to your questions and comments. I can't hear you.
Okay.
I think you're
You can
muted.
hear me.
Right.
Okay. Let me, okay. Okay. Do you think, let me just see here. How's that? Okay. Do you think there's any possibility of escalation to the point that there would be NATO forces fighting at some point in Ukraine, or do you think that's unlikely?
I think it's unlikely. I think, you can say deterrence did not work in the run up to the war because we were unable to deter Putin from starting it. But since the war began, deterrence seems to be working both ways, right? The US and NATO are not undertaking, they're not sending soldiers there, and the US isn't sending certain weapons there because they don't want to escalate. And Russia so far has been deterred. It hasn't done anything to directly attack a NATO country. Putin announcing now that he wants to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus seems to up the ante, but I think one has to, we'll wait and see what happens with that. But I do think that NATO has agreed that it cannot send troops to fight in Ukraine, because if it did, then Russia, would say that NATO is essentially attacking Russia, right? If the Russians say, if their troops and they're near these areas that Russia has annexed, they could say it's attacking Russia. And then I think you do have to worry about Russia and Putin and the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And I think so far he's doing this to intimidate the West, and he's succeeding, by the way, in doing that, because that is one of the reasons why we haven't taken more action. But I think even though one can't dismiss the threats of nuclear weapons, I think the likelihood is low at the moment. But I think if you had NATO troops there, that would be a game changer. And so I think that's not going to happen.
Okay. There has been reported, probably propaganda from the Ukrainians, maybe from us, that Putin is not in good health, but people have said this for 15 years now. Do you think there's any evidence that he is terminally ill, or that he's under so much stress he's going to resign? There are those rumors. Is there any truth to any of this?
Right. So I've read all those rumors, and I've seen the social media posting that when Putin went to Mariupol last week, it wasn't him, it was a body double. I mean, I can just quote now CIA Director Bill Burns, who gave a talk on the record at Georgetown a few weeks ago and was asked that question. And he said, as far as they know, Putin is not terminally ill. I think, what you can say is that Putin was really isolated during COVID. He only talked to a few people around him who reinforced all of his views and paranoia. And so I think maybe his sense of reality is maybe not what it was before. But I watch videos of him out in public. He's going out now. He speaks much more. So we don't have any real evidence of that.
Okay. There are people who say that the real threat is China and not Russia, because the Russian military has done so poorly. But they do have cyber capacity, which is an asymmetrical form of warfare that has done a lot of damage. A lot of the anti-vaccine movement, and people don't realize it, in the United States is not from Tucker Carlson. He's reading the bots coming out of Russia. There are 4 different studies that show the cyber warfare in the United States is affecting public attitudes on not just on vaccines for COVID, all vaccines, which is very damaging to our public health system.
Yeah, so I mean, China probably in the longer run is more of a threat. But I mean, I think Russia, it has those kind of cyber capabilities. By the way, one thing it has not done yet, and that maybe is also a result of deterrence, is use cyber capabilities more in Ukraine in terms of interfering with the state's ability to function. But I think all of those cyber capabilities are very dangerous, and the Russians are very good at this kind of disinformation and disruption, even if their army doesn't perform so well. And they have over 6,000 nuclear warheads. So I see Russia as on a par, at least, as a threat with China.
Nord Stream 2. Who blew up that line? Do you have any inside track on where it came from?
Well, I mean, the latest, right, was a couple of weeks ago. There were stories in our media that, investigations had concluded that it was, quote unquote, a pro-Ukrainian group of Ukrainians and Russians but not the Ukrainian government, who had somehow rented a boat and gone with these explosives and planted them, and that they were responsible for that. And I guess it quoted, unnamed US government officials saying that they believed this was true. Of course, we have Cy Hirsch, who came out, I guess a month or two ago, saying it was the CIA that did it. Other people believe that the Russians did it. So who knows? And I don't know whether we'll ever know.
Yeah, I think you're right. Is there any scenario you can see where the Russians would sue for peace in a way that would not be favorable to them? In other words, would move back from the position they've taken geographically? Or is that just not going to happen?
Well, so, there is a Russian counteroffensive going on at the moment, or offensive going on at the moment, which seems to be stalled. The Ukrainians, they say, are going to launch a counteroffensive soon. Ukrainians don't want to talk about it for obvious reasons. It's possible that if the Ukrainians have the equipment that they need, that they could push the Russians back from some of the territory that Russia now occupies. But that would have to be, I think, fairly substantial to get. The Russians would really have to believe that the Ukrainians were about to sort of oust them completely in order for them to sit down. And even though I know that there are people in this country who believe that the Ukrainians can do that this year, I think that would be very difficult for them to do. So that's my way of saying I don't really see a scenario this year or maybe going into next where the Russians are forced to sit down and sue for peace. I mean, I think they would only sit down if they believe that they've taken enough territory and that they want to pause in the fighting, and therefore they might agree to a ceasefire. But the condition would be that the Ukrainians would then have to accept the annexation of these 4 territories that Russia doesn't control fully. And if any Ukrainian leader who did that is out of office the next day. So, this is why it's very hard to imagine at this point either side wanting to sit down and negotiate.
Is there reports that the morale in the Russian army, is that all is very poor? Is that all propaganda, or do we actually have intelligence that the Ukrainian morale seems to be very high and the support for the president? But what about on the Russian side?
I don't think morale on the Russian side is very high, because I don't think that a lot of these young men know what it is that they're fighting for, and they're not being properly equipped. I mean, what we do have are videos and telephone conversations that have been released, at least, assuming that they're not AI, but they are real telephone conversations with people bitterly complaining about the conditions under which they're serving, about the lack of instructions from their superiors, that they're just sent out to some fight. They don't even know why they're there. So I don't, from what we can see, morale does not seem to be particularly high among the Russians.
Some people would argue, particularly before the invasion, that we could manage our relationship with the Russians. This is simply another example of great power rivalry that is the norm in world history. That would be the Mearsheimer view, which I personally don't accept. But and you appear, but I agree with you. I think Steve Kotkin argues the same way you do, that this is historic Russian behavior that predates NATO, and he's said, as you have, that this is not a function of what NATO did or did not do. Right. This is Tsarist behavior and Soviet behavior, just in a different form. But can we manage a relationship with them, or do they really want to destroy the international system? I agree with you. The Chinese want to dominate a system, but they want ground rules. It doesn't appear Russia wants any ground rules at all. They want chaos.
Right. So, I mean, we have been able to manage relations with the Soviet Union and Russia in the past, right?
Right.
But we should remind ourselves that in the Soviet system, there were institutions that functioned and we dealt with those institutions. But in this very highly personalized Putin system, institutions can't count for very little, and there are no real checks and balances on Putin's power. So it's already a different system. But of course, we could manage a relationship with Russia, but not at the moment. The one bedrock of this relationship, starting in 1972, when Nixon first went to the Soviet Union and they signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties with Brezhnev, is strategic stability and arms control. This is something where over the decades, irrespective of who's in power, we've met and we have a common interest as the two nuclear superpowers in ensuring strategic stability. Well, this now for the first time, the Russians have said, we don't want to talk about strategic stability anymore. They've suspended their participation in the New START agreement, which they really wanted. I mean, they wanted it as much as we did. And so even those lines of communication where we have professionals on both sides who talk to each other, experts on these nuclear issues, that's more or less fallen apart now. And the Russians have said at the moment, we're not interested in strategic stability talks. So this is why at the present moment, it appears to be very difficult to think of a way that we could even begin to re-engage and manage this relationship with Russia. But of course, once the war is over, whenever it ends, we are going to have to do that. It's going to be a very tough road, but I think it would have to begin with the restoration of these talks on strategic stability. Otherwise, if 2026 comes around and we haven't made any progress on that, we will have no agreements that regulate the nuclear arsenals of the two nuclear superpowers. And of course, that will lead to greater proliferation.
One of the things that Putin said recently that I think there's one article I've seen on it was that the international currency should no longer be the dollar, that countries should use the reserve currency of the Chinese yuan as the reserve currency of the world. Is that something do you think there's some sort of an agreement with? I know the Chinese want that, but is that going to happen? Is that?
Well, I think it would take time to happen. I do note that now Russia is doing more of its business with China in yuan than it's ever done before. It used to be in dollars and then in euros. I think it will still take quite a long time to dislodge the dollar as the major international currency. And we have to also think about the rest of the world, the other countries, that whether they'd be prepared to do that too. So I think this is a little premature.
The brain drain from Russia, which you mentioned, is very severe because it's not older people who have a sixth grade education. It tends to be younger people. Well, it's very interesting. Putin has very high poll ratings generally, but if you look at the data and you break it down, the under 30 have not been Putin fans for a long time. And it does appear that they're the ones who are tech savvy and where there's a huge loss in terms of intellectual capacity in Russia. Is that going to continue, do you think?
Well, I think it's going to continue, as long as the war goes on and people don't want to be drafted, but also as long as Russia, is such a repressive society where people, can't express their views either, in person on the street or on paper or on the media, whatever. So I think this has been going on for some time since Putin started to crack down, at least a decade or more ago. But that, ultimately the long-term consequences for Russia are quite serious. These people will only come back to Russia if they can live in a society which is freer and, in a society that's more modern and where there are institutions.
So the Russian military reforms that we all thought, I thought were actually improving the capacity of the Russian government don't appear to have worked very well. What do you ascribe to the reason for the incompetence of the Russian military after years of attempts at reform?
Corruption. So yes, after very poor showing of the Russian army in the Russia-Georgia war in 2008. They had a new defense minister, and they were going to implement all of these modernizing reforms. They were going to have a professional army rather than an enlisted men army. But a lot of these reforms were never really carried out properly because a lot of the money that was allocated to them went into lined people's pockets. And so they don't have the modern equipment that they need. If you've seen pictures of some of the equipment, goes back again to the morale of the Russian soldiers. Some of the equipment they're given, they have rusted out Kalashnikov rifles, tanks that don't work properly. And then they didn't do enough, they didn't invest enough in training. So it's largely due to corruption apparently the Kremlin was unaware of this, but this is a corruption that pervades all of Russian society, but it pervaded the military too. And that's why the army has performed much worse than people thought it would.
One of the things that happened after the summit between Xi Jinping and Putin was that Xi Jinping, I think, stopped off in Central Asia. And the Chinese have more competition in some ways with the Russians in Central Asia than we do. Is it shocking to you that the Chinese are taking advantage? Not shocking, but surprising that Xi Jinping would be so bold to take advantage of Russian weakness to cement Chinese dominance in Central Asia.
Well, Russia is now very much the junior partner in this relationship. Some Russians, who disagree with this, say Russia is now a vassal of China. So the Russian leverage has really decreased. And I'm not surprised. I mean, China has been the dominant economic power in Central Asia for some time. But until recently, it accepted a division of labor where kind of Russia was the security provider, had all the political relationships with the Central Asian leaders, and the Chinese were strictly economic. Although with the Belt and Road, with a country like Kazakhstan, nothing's strictly economic. If you're building ports and roads and pipelines and things, it's security as well. So for the first time, right, China is doing with the 5 Central Asian states +1, and that +1 being China. We, the United States, have done it. We did it fairly recently. Secretary Blinken was there, and of course the Russians do it all the time. So I think the Chinese are now being much bolder in their attempt to increase their influence in Central Asia. But that's also because there's fertile ground. The Central Asian countries look askance on what Russia is doing in Ukraine. The Kazakhs particularly, since from Putin's point of view, if he's going to create a new Slavic Union state, northern Kazakhstan would be part of it too, because there are large numbers of Slavic population there. So the Kazakhs have really tried to distance themselves from Russia, but other Central Asian countries too. And so China is just getting in there, stepping into the vacuum there and solidifying its ties. Xi Jinping was already in Kazakhstan last year for bilateral talks with the Kazakh president, who, by the way, speaks fluent Chinese because he lived and studied there. But you'll see other players coming in. Turkey is getting more active in Central Asia. There's a new association of Turkic states. Iran, to some extent, certainly in Tajikistan. So Russia is definitely losing out in that area as a result of the war with Ukraine.
Do you think it's likely that China will arm Russia if they see Russia falling or failing in this new counteroffensive of the Russians, of the Ukrainians?
I think it is likely. I don't know exactly what they would deliver, but since they really don't want Russia to lose, and it's in their interest to have this war go on, right? As long as this war goes on, we're all focused on that, and we haven't taken our eye off Taiwan, but we're less focused on Taiwan. So I think they might do that if they really believe that the Russian army is in serious trouble.
So there was nearly a conflict between Turkey and Iran recently over Azerbaijan, and the Iranian army put pontoons across one of the rivers right on the border with Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan signed a defense treaty with Turkey. That could be the trigger that brings NATO into the Middle East if Turkey were attacked by Iran. How is that dynamic between Azerbaijan, Iran, and Turkey affecting the Turks' interest in the Ukrainian war?
Well, I mean, Erdogan has really, put Turkey forward as a mediator, and it has mediated on some issues. For instance, food security and the continued export of Ukrainian grain. Turkey worked with the United Nations there. Prisoner exchanges, Turkey has been quite active there. So, of course, this new dynamic, and of course, Turkey has also gained from the fact that Russia has really been absent. I mean, the Armenians are furious now with Russia. And in fact, Armenia signed on to the International Criminal Court Rome Statute a day after the arrest warrant was issued, which is interesting. So Russia is less of a presence now, for instance, on the Nagorno-Karabakh issue between Armenia and Azerbaijan. On the other hand, obviously, its relationship with Iran has strengthened. So I don't quite know how that particular dynamic would affect Turkey's role. I think Turkey will continue to want to put itself forward as a neutral party, which does have pretty good ties to Ukraine as well as Russia. So this is Erdogan's maneuvering act.
Okay. I think we're running out of time now, Dr. Stent. Thank you very much for being with us. We've appreciated, and we've appreciated your insights into what's happening. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank
Everybody
you.
should get the book and read it.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Goodbye.